about where I'm at in terms of my hanger on her, because I hang on it. Tomorrow I meet with neurosurgeons team. I also get to talk with Kansas City neurosurgeons because they've been waiting on me to have a tooth pulled, and I got that done without the privilege of anesthetics because I don't need them. So they just yanked on and it was done in 15 minutes. Waited 4 months to have that done. And I have still another broken vertebrae that slipped on its own. And so they're going to tell me what kind of surgery I'm going to have. And if it was like the last one, it's going to be pretty simple. They just put two big, very large needles in my back, pushed one of them up. I hope they do that this next time. Of course, I'm not awake when they do that. Although I did wake up in the middle of surgery while they were pounding on the needles. I hope that's what they do, and I hope that's all they do. Otherwise, there's a much more serious surgery ahead of them. And they'll let me know tomorrow. Yay, finally. And if that's what happens, next time I come, you won't see this. You'll just me. Keep me in prayer. Thank you. To quote our favorite radio announcer, Paul Harvey, now to the rest of the story. Jesus was at the shore teaching his disciples when a man by the name of Jairus came and fell to his feet, pleading with him. So let's find out about this fellow. Jairus was the keeper of the synagogue. And he was a pretty well-known and pretty important person. He was a Jew. He wasn't a Pharisee, but he was the keeper of the synagogue, which you knew in those days was a pretty important place for Jews to worship God. And he was very wealthy as a result of this job, this responsibility. And when he came to Jesus, that was a crucial decision because he had to decide, do I go to Jesus or do I not? Because when he made that decision, he forfeited a lot of responsibilities, a lot of his job title, a lot of what his community of Jews would think about him. Because Jesus was basically an outcast among the Jews. But his daughter was dying. His only daughter was dying. You see the decision he had to make? He had to decide, do I just stay in charge of my job responsibilities or do I go to Jesus? And his decision was pretty clear-cut. He felt he had to go to Jesus. Take a chance. He'd heard enough about Jesus. He thought maybe he knew enough. And he decided. And so he went to Jesus. He fell down in front of Jesus and he pleaded with Jesus. And Jesus said nothing. He got up and went with Jairus. And all the people gathered around them and pressed in upon Jesus and Jairus. And they knew where they were going, but they just shuffled in. And this was the story that I left you with. Do you remember last time? Yeah, okay. So now you know the crowd is moving. And now we have two people, Jairus, Jesus. But I forgot to tell you, this was also the same story I told you last time. There was the woman who had bled for 12 years. Now, interesting. Jairus' daughter was also 12. Excuse me. And so when the crowd pressed in on them, the movement towards Jairus' home became very slow. And the crowd went with them, and they were pressing so hard that the actual word that was used for pressing was the same word that is used for pressing grapes. So you see, this whole thing was just a mash of people, because they thought, well, all you have to do is just touch Jesus and something magical will happen. Well, it turned out that nothing in the crowd happened at all, but they thought it might happen. And so the Jairus and Jesus were moving towards Jairus' home. And in the meantime, this woman who had bled for 12 years was working her way towards Jesus. So now, incidentally, we have that story happening as well. And as the crowd is moving towards Jairus' home to talk or press on, thinking that Jairus was believing in Jesus and believing wholeheartedly with Jesus, that something was going to happen with Jairus' daughter, the woman that bled for 12 years came into that setting. And Jairus was just fit to be tied because he needed Jesus to do something for his daughter. Now we have an incident that happens because Jesus and the woman are intersecting with each other when Jairus is intersecting with Jesus. And as this occasion happens, the woman touches Jesus at the very same time that Jairus' handyman tells him, "Quit bothering the teacher, your daughter is dead." At the same time that the woman that bled for 12 years has touched Jesus. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Now do you see the conflict? Now we have the conflusion of three people. And Jesus turns and says, and then he engages with the woman because she has fallen down on her knees pleading. But she also recognizes she's healthy. She's been healed just by the touch. But she must now confess, "It was me, Lord." And she worships Jesus, and they have a conversation. And Jairus is saying, "It's my daughter. She's dead." Can I ask you a question? A question you don't need to answer because I already know what you're going to say. But is it true for parents, for grandparents, even great-grandparents? I'm a great-grandfather. That probably one of the worst things that we try to avoid, we hope it never happens to any of us, is that one of our children dies before we do. don't we sweat about that? Don't we worry about that? Don't we go out of our way to prevent that? Is that one of our children will die before we do? And quite frankly, we think about that and we worry about that all our life. And Jairus is told, before he even gets to his house, my daughter, who is now 12 years old and is probably being primed for her marriage, is dead. But still, he has enough faith in Jesus that they press on towards his house. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He just knows that Jesus can do something, and they press on with this crowd towards his house. Because Jesus is determined to go to the house. And Jairus must go with him. And so they go on and on and on. They inch on and on. And the crowd begins to disperse. Because Jairus saw a miracle happen with the woman. Well, if that can happen, what might he do for me? And so they go on towards the house. And as they get closer to the house, there's all kinds of noise going on. Somebody's playing a flute. Other people are moaning and carrying on, crying and carrying on. And this is all going on in his house, and he's wondering, what in the world? Well, it's a common fact that when somebody dies in a house, they hire people to come mourn for them. And if they're really wealthy, lots of mourners come because they get paid to cry out and to moan and to play a musical flute. And the persons that do the best job get the most money. So they're in competition with each other. Can you imagine that? Well, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it, but it's true. They hire people to come moan at the house of the person who has died. And I think that probably it was a friend, it might have been a Pharisee, that hired all these people to come to the house. They knew the girl was going to die, so they hired people. And they came to the house and started making all kinds of racket, moaning and carrying on and playing flutes. And they're just moaning, oh my. And the louder they were, the better it was. Jesus said, what you doing? What are you doing here? Well, she died and we're moaning. And he says, get out of here. Get out of here. She's not dead. She's sleeping. And they just break out laughing at him. She's not dead. She is sleeping. Jesus knew that. Something's going on here. Something pretty important's going on. And he and 3 disciples, James, John, and Peter, he took him to the house with him, and he scattered all the people who were moaning and carrying on. Get out of here. She's just sleeping. took the husband, Giles, into the bedroom of the dead girl. You see, I use the word dead girl, but Jesus used the word sleeping. Same word is used to describe both. And she's covered with a sheet. Do I know that she's dead? I don't know. The Bible says she is. Do I know she's sleeping? Jesus says she is. He pulls back the sheet. It is forbidden practice for a Jew to touch a dead child, touch a dead body. You can't do that. But Jesus did. If she's sleeping, just wake her up. If she's dead, you have committed a foul sin. You are unclean if you touch a dead body. So now, in your mind, you decide. You make up your own mind. You decide. Is she dead or is she sleeping? It's a wonderful decision that you get to make. Jesus touches her hand and whispers to her 2 words. And the child wakes up and startles her family. And Jesus tells the parents, "You be hush-hush about this. Don't you tell anybody what you have seen." And you know why? Because he doesn't want them to be harmed by anybody. And all that he needs to do is, she was asleep, if anybody inquires. But don't go out and advertise. Don't tell them what you have seen. So I think it's a problem for us, isn't it, that we must decide what happened. Was she dead or was she asleep? We must decide that. But in part to that common question of Tabitha cum, arise, little girl. And he told the parents, feed her, she's hungry. And so, okay, girl wakes up, are you hungry? Yeah, I'm hungry. Feed her, she's hungry. What does he mean by that as he reaches out to us? Because he knew already what he was going to do. And it is a miracle. And as it reached down to us through the ages, that death does not have authority when it comes to Jesus. It's a nice little tune to go with it. It's time to wake up. That was nice. It hit perfect timing. God did it. Remember that. At the end of my sermon, it was perfect timing. And it was perfect timing for the story, too, wasn't it? It was good timing. It was. And before I turn you loose today, here's one thing I would like to share with you. And it comes from doing the sermons of funerals. We had a funeral yesterday. I wasn't conducting the funeral. I was just attending. It was about a young man. It was a difficult funeral for the family. He had achieved almost 2 years of sobriety from multiple addictions. And we don't know if he, at the depth of depression, had OD'd on too much. But he was almost 2 years clean. But maybe had an episode where he had reached back to demons. But it was a large gathering of friends and workmates and family that surrounded him. And he was saying, I don't have any friends. And demons work that way. Demons delude you and they mystify us. Whenever I've done funerals for young people and older people and elderly people, church members and non-church members, I see something that happens. I call them BCs, borderline Christians. You know what I'm talking about. It's also CEOs, Christian and Easter only Christians. And I'm not making fun of them, but it's a shorthand that pastors talk about when we talk about people. It's a way of describing someone who has been baptized and never sees the door of a church ever again, except when somebody dies. And then they show up, and that's all they really do. And I have to look out and say, is there some way that I can reach you? But the first thing I have to do is find you. I don't know where you go. And it puts a hardship on our churches and a hardship on them. And I wish there was a way to reach out, to touch them. So there is a message I always say, always read at funerals. And it goes like this. Do you remember when Jesus let Lazarus die? His best friend. Well, one of his good friends, Lazarus. Let him die, and determinedly let him die. And Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days. Remember that story? And Jesus had already set his mind. I need some water. Medication dryness. I love pills. He had let him die because he said when he got word that Lazarus was dying, he said, I'm going to stay here 2 more days before we set our mind to Jerusalem. This is the end time. so that you may see the glory of God. Do you remember that statement that he said to his disciples? So you may see the glory of God. And then he said, I'm setting my mind to Jerusalem, and we're going to go. And this was in Bethany, where Lazarus was entombed. And as he got near Bethany, which was 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, Martha was the first to come running to him. And Martha said, Lord, Jesus said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Oh, such confidence, pure confidence that Martha said this. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Beautiful confidence. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now listen carefully. And I do this for the family as much as I do for the licky-loos that come, and then I never see them again, because they have to hear this. This is something they have to hear, and we have to hear it. Because Jesus is saying something to Martha, but he's saying something to us. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? And that statement has ruled the universe and has come down for 2,000 years, unhinged, untampered with, to our very souls. Do you believe this? Shalom.